now that we've actually applied a script to our object and we've got it moving around, we've got some functionality built in now. We've proven that it can happen. Now what we want to do is we want to step back a little bit. We want to make sure that we actually learn what it is that we're doing here so that we don't just copy-paste code and become reliant on other people's code. We want to be able to develop that code ourselves. So one thing that we can do is always, just like with anything, it's about looking at what was done, study it, break it down, and then soak that in so that you can then do it on your own. And part of that is just taking a peek back at what was it that we copy and pasted. We look in there and we see that we've got variables for speed, rotational speed. These things are controlling the amount of speed that the object moves and rotates. And we can see that it is a variable so that inside of the inspector we can actually use that variable as a designer and change things up on the fly. Inside of the update we can see that we're actually setting some variables to the input axis, into the axis for the vertical and the horizontal. And below that we can see that we're setting it up so that we're running our game, our objects, the moving of the objects based on the actual time instead of the speed of the computer. And below that you can see that we're translating along our object's position and rotating along our object's position. So we're basically just moving an object based on input, what we were looking at in the very beginning. So let's go ahead and get rid of this one. And let's go back to the very beginning. We've got our function update. We want to move the player based on input. So let's go up to our inspector, and as we can remember from before, we were wanting some kind of speed variable. So let's go inside. Let's set up a variable. We want it exposed to the inspector so that we can actually adjust it as a designer. So we're going to make a variable. We're going to call this just our player speed. And let's make this a float variable. And we'll make it default to, let's say, 10.0. This way we've got a default speed for our player. And then inside of our update, let's look at just simply moving our object first. So before we even get to the input, we're just going to think about, let's just see if I can move this object just with script. So how do I move something? What am I looking for? I'm translating this object. I'm transforming this object. So let's go into our API. Let's just do our transform. And we have an option in our search for transform. And if we look at it, this is basically going to allow us to work with position, rotation, and scale of an object. So if we're trying to move an object inside of our scene, we can move it with our transform. And then if we look to a function down here at the bottom, we want to be able to use a function to move that object's position, translate that object, or rotate that object, or scale that object. So let's say we're going to translate the object. So in here we can see that we can translate it along an XYZ axis. So we can actually pick it from what we call just a vector 3, which just holds 3 variables, and here we're choosing them as an X, Y, and Z. If we look at the function, you can see that it's the vector 3, X, Y, Z, and then relative to, this is the either itself or to the world as to how it moves. So let's go in here and let's actually fill in this function. Let's say we just write this out. We're going to transform dot translate, and then what are we going to do? We're going to translate it along which axis? So we could say, let's just fill this in. We're going to say 0, 0, 0. And then we're going to close that off, put a semicolon. Now if we do this, then it moves it along no axis. So we're not going to get any movement at all. But let's just try it. Let's hit save. We've got it applied to our object. We can see in our script that our player speed changed, so we've got our variable set up right now. Now if we hit play, our object doesn't go anywhere. So let's tie in some speed to our movement. So if we're going to do this as X, Y, and Z, let's move this along the Y axis going up. So we're going to say Y, and we'll do this as a player speed. And we'll hit save. We'll go back over to Unity, and we'll hit play. And you notice our object just disappeared all of a sudden. So it moved up at a player speed of 10, but it also moved up not based on seconds, but more so the speed of the computer. So we want to be able to have this play just fine on everyone's machine. So let's do one more thing here. We're going to multiply this. We're going to multiply this by a time.delta time. So I'm going to go time.delta time. We'll save this one out. We'll go back to Unity and hit play. There we go. We got a little bit more of a slowdown. Now, if we go in here, we can actually change our speed. And watch this. If we set to, let's say, a negative, we could start bringing our object back down. Whoop, there it goes. Whoop, there it is. So here we actually have control through the inspector to move our object up and down by changing the speed of the object. So try that for a minute. Make sure you can make that work. Let's stop here. So that gives us actual movement. It moves our object inside of the scene, and that's kind of the starting point. We actually want to be able to get control of moving that object, get it around inside the scene, and then we can start looking into how do I tie something like input into moving that object. So take a moment, try plugging in some variables to the other X, Y, or Z variables, and see what kind of effects you can achieve with it.